In the 1980s, the state of Pennsylvania was home to several serial killers. One of them was Gary Heidnik, who held people captive in the basement of his home. Before the 80s were over, another serial killer would emerge. Harrison Graham was much like Heidnik. He may not have designed a bunker under the house, but his house was a true house of horrors. In 1987, Graham lived in a squalid apartment building on North Street, and the neighborhood was not a decent one, where poverty ran deep. Aside from those who found homes and lived in them, the streets were full of homeless people. There was everything from illegal drug dealing to sex trafficking. It was not uncommon for the police to raid this area. On a hot day in 1987, Graham's apartment smelled foul. No matter how much the neighbors warned him, he never fixed the problem. Finally, they decided to report him to the landlord. He was already failing to pay his rent, so the landlord asked him to move out. On August 9th, Graham left the apartment via the fire escape by blocking the front door with boards from behind without informing the landlord. When the landlord arrived and could not get into the apartment, he called the police. The apartment at 1631 North Street appeared to be abandoned. Officer Pete Scalatino was the first to respond to complaints of foul odors that afternoon. When he entered the dilapidated apartment, he immediately recognized the smell of death. There was everything from rotting food to feces. There were crude sketches on the wall. Most disturbing was a drawing of a naked woman with what looked like dried blood. As the police walked around the house, they saw a door. The name Marty was carved on the door, and there was a keyhole under the door. When he bent down and looked inside, he saw a human figure. The person he saw on the floor behind the door was standing motionless. Scalatino immediately called for assistance. With the help of Inspector Charles Johnson, the door was forced open, revealing the body of a black woman lying on a mattress. The lifeless body was swollen and decomposing. Next to the mattress was a second body, another woman lying lifeless on the floor. The two men needed further assistance. It was difficult to determine whether the deaths were drug-related or homicides. In areas like this, it was very common for people to lose their lives to illegal substances. When the detectives arrived at the scene, a crowd began to gather. As the police surrounded the scene and began to investigate, another body was found. The victim was skeletal. Whatever was going on at 1631 North Street had been going on for some time. The search continued. Working their way through syringes, spoons, broken glass, dog feces, and human remains, the teams found a fourth victim within hours. She was wrapped in a blanket and stuffed into a closet. The search, which had begun in the afternoon, was now moving towards sunset. At 5:30 p.m., the search team found body number 5 hidden between two mattresses. This body was not wrapped or bound, but had decomposed to the point that its sex could not be determined. An officer called to the men in the back room. He had found another body in the front closet, which was full of garbage and dirty old clothes. What kind of house was this? The cops found a body at every turn. The residents, unaware of this, were shocked because the apartment had turned into a graveyard. When the number of bodies reached 6, the search was called off until morning. Crowds of people from outside the neighborhood and local residents gathered around the building. The media had picked up the story of a possible serial killer in the city of Philadelphia. On August 10th, the search was expanded outside the apartment building. A search of the building's roof turned up more body parts, a severed leg, and a foot. As more steps were taken, the murders grew. The morning newspapers published a picture of the tenant in her machette, a handsome, young, healthy-looking black man. His name was written under the picture, Harrison Graham. The police department immediately alerted officers and all other authorities in the area. Harrison was known to his neighbors as Marty. He was described as quiet and docile. The tenants were not afraid of him. In fact, he had done repair work for some of them and had no history of being a threat. As is often the case with serial killers, his involvement in the grisly crime took his neighbors by surprise. The rumors on the street were different. Harrison Graham seemed mild-mannered, especially to users of illegal substances, but he also sold illegal substances. He received $300 a month from Social Security, but he seemed to live on illegal drug money. The victims were autopsied, and there were no signs of physical trauma or violence. The first 2 bodies had decomposed quickly due to the heat. In fact, they had been dead only a few days. The medical examiner identified the sex of these bodies as female, while the other victims had not been identified. While all this was going on, the Daily News ran a story about the relatives and friends of one of the victims, Cookie Mathis. Cookie's husband heard about the shirt found on a body and realized it was his wife. He bought the shirt for her. Anthropologists were called in to gather information from the tissue and bones. Within a week, the public would help police solve more identity mysteries. The media ran stories about the madman on the loose as Harrison was still on the run. One man contacted police to ask about his wife, who had been missing for more than 2 years. Another victim's roommate told authorities that he believed Sandra Garvin had gone to buy illegal substances from Harrison. She never returned. The debris at the crime scene also filled in the missing pieces. Some of the missing people's jewelry was found here. The public and possible relatives of the victims were crucial to police identification. Despite the best efforts of the police, Harrison Graham was still nowhere to be found. The wanted suspect had 4 younger siblings and his mother, Lily, who lived in the Philadelphia area. The family appealed to Harrison to return home. He had been seen at local shelters and even on a city bus, but somehow continued to elude investigators. Investigators continued to search above, below, and around the building. Some bones were recovered from the land surrounding the apartment. However, a coroner's examination determined that they were not human remains, but animal remains. Another body was found on August 15th. The search spread to neighboring buildings, and in the basement of a complex down the street from Graham's house, under what appeared to be a burn pile, another person was found, similarly wrapped in a blanket and tied with an electrical cord. An examination revealed that only the torso and skull remained. This led investigators to question whether there was an 8th victim or connection to the leg bones found earlier. So far, there have been 7 known murders. As the search for Harrison Graham intensified, the coroner tried to put names to the bodies. A woman named Mary Jeter Mathis, a mother of 5, had been identified. As detectives tried to piece together the mystery, Lillian Graham received a phone call that could provide investigators with important answers. It was from her son, Harrison Graham. On August 17th, the phone rang at Lillian Graham's home in Philadelphia. He asked if his mother could see him and bring him something to eat. His mother was able to convince Harrison to come home, that whatever had happened, they could work it out. When Harrison told Graham that he was coming home, his mother immediately called the police. Before he could get home, he was caught on the street corner and taken to the police station for questioning. So who was Harrison Graham? What kind of life did he lead? Harrison Graham was born in Philadelphia on September 9, 1959. The oldest of 5 children, he showed signs of mental retardation early in his childhood and had performance and discipline problems in school. Graham was expelled from high school for por gradis and absenteeism. His mother later claimed that Harrison was diagnosed with a mental disorder in 1971 and spent 2 years in a mental hospital or nursing home, but this claim was not substantiated. In the early 1970s, Graham worked in many areas of the construction industry. In 1979, he left his family's home and moved to North Philadelphia. He found a home in a neighborhood rife with poverty and crime. During this time, he began using alcohol and drugs. Harrison, a tall and athletic man, was not considered violent toward others and was never charged with a crime. In 1983, Harrison rented an apartment in a housing development of mostly vacant lots. Some residents, including Graham, used part of the parking lot to buy and sell illegal substances. Over the next 4 years, Graham turned his apartment into a hotbed where friends and acquaintances frequented to buy and use substances, mostly Ritalin and related substances. However, Graham was never known to be involved in violent behavior. By 1987, he regularly paid his rent and played basketball with young people. He lived on a disability check. He was described by friends and neighbors as a good man, but inside that good man was a monster. What kind of person he had become would be revealed during the interrogations. Although he initially denied his crimes during the detectives' interrogations, he eventually confessed to killing 7 people. At first, he reluctantly admitted to one murder, then he softened and told the whole truth. He said it was Marty who did the killing. One of his victims was his ex-girlfriend, Robin DeShazer. According to Harrison, he didn't like having sex with his girlfriend. He was happier when he wasn't with her. So he came up with a different solution. After strangling his girlfriend, he somehow felt more comfortable having sex with her. He was aware of the desires of Marty, whom he called his alter ego, but not of his own. Harrison Graham had lured all of his victims he knew or met on the street with drugs. Graham met someone for sex in a perfectly normal way. He said he would wake up in the morning to find a woman lying dead next to him. In fact, he was shocked by the sight. He admitted that he was so shaken by what he had done to his first victim, DeShazer, that he left her body in his apartment because he didn't know what to do next. He had not tried to hide the body until he had brought another woman to his apartment, and then he had taken the body out of his bedroom window onto the roof. During the interrogation, Graham wrote a 10-page confession. Although he was a confessed criminal, the issue of mental illness came up during his trial. A public defender, Joel Moldovsky, was appointed. On August 27, 1986, during the 6-hour trial, a detective described the gruesome appearance of the remains. Harrison Graham did not look at all comfortable when this was told. He said that Graham always kept his head drucken while living with so many bodies around him because the sight of birds eating the bodies around him made it worse. According to attorney Moldovsky, these and other characteristic bizarre behaviors were crucial in determining his client's criminal responsibility. In addition, Dr. Robert Stanton, a psychiatrist, had evaluated Graham and determined that he had an IQ set of 63, which was considered below the level of criminal responsibility. This, coupled with his substance abuse and addictions, resulted in a man who was not criminally responsible under the laws of the state of Philadelphia. Harrison suffered from chemically induced auditory hallucinations, psychosis, blackouts, and chronic paranoia. In addition, a psychologist, Albert Levitt, testified that in addition to the defendant's chemical and physiological problems, Harrison was deficient in basic skills such as reading, writing, mathematics, and telling time. Shockingly, despite the evidence to the contrary, Judge Edward McKell ruled that Graham was competent to stand trial. He based his decision on the prosecution's presentation of the confession. Contrary to the prosecution's position, Moldovsky argued insanity, specifically multiple personality disorder. In an interview with the Philadelphia Daily News, the attorney said that Harrison Graham often spoke with a second and third personality. Marty was a docile mechanic. He loved his mother, was heterosexual, and a religious zealot. Occasionally, Junior would show up. This personality was known as the boyish boy who neighbors remembered hugging the Cookie Monster stuffed animal. It was Frank who was responsible for heinous crimes, both murder and necrophilia. Unlike Marty, who hated the sinful nature of homosexuality, it was Frank who could not bear to be with a woman. He thought it was a sentence of eternal death. Frank, however, had the street smarts to crave drugs and harder homosexual relationships. This was something he had encountered in his own youth. During the trials, Harrison had been involved in a fight in prison and blamed it on Frank. The prosecutor recognized this as Harrison Graham's ability to fake it. Dr. Gerald Cook, a psychologist, testified that Graham had brain damage. Cook also said that Graham suffered from sexual sadism, which is not a mental illness that makes a person insane or removes guilt. So he appeared to be an ineffective witness on key issues. Mother Graham told the court that she did not believe her son was capable of such horrific crimes. She thought her son was a very simple and non-violent person. Even if he had been under the influence of the alcohol or drugs he was accused of using, he would not have found the environment in which to plan such crimes or hide the bodies. As the trials continued, the prosecution decided to call a former girlfriend of Graham's, Paula, to the stand. Paula testified that Graham choked her during sex and that she passed out several times. She also said that she had confessed this to her first lover, DeShazer. Naturally, Paula was afraid to leave this man. That's why their relationship continued. According to her testimony, she was sexually assaulted, beaten, and tortured by Harrison Graham. On March 8th, Harrison Graham told the judge that he was not responsible for the murders and that somebody else did it. Harrison waived his right to a jury, leaving his fate in the hands of the judge. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The burly black man was almost indifferent as he listened to his sentence. He later told reporters that everything is going to be all right. He demanded that the Cookie Monster be returned to him, saying it was no longer needed as evidence. Moldovsky never had to fight for his client. In May, the judge sentenced defendant Harrison Graham to death on 6 counts, but he received a life sentence for 1 murder. And the judge initially said he would serve the life sentence. The only life sentence was for DeShazor's murder. DeShazor was the first murder, so there were no other murders to add aggravating factors. Harrison Graham was an inmate at Harrisburg Prison in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania until 1994. But then, after a routine review, the Supreme Court found his sentence to be unethical and illegal. The court ordered that Graham's life sentence be vacated and that he be sentenced to death. He was then scheduled to die on December 7, 1998. The judge was once again in the position of deciding whether Graham should live or die. He stayed the execution. The killer's case spent most of its time on appeal until 2002, when the U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of all mentally retarded offenders. Harrison did not meet the original requirements of the ban. As a psychiatrist involved in his case noted, he was not mentally retarded, even though test results showed his IQ was below 70. However, according to the American Psychiatric Association's criteria, the onset of mental illness before the age of 18 required an exemption from execution. Harrison Graham was thus permanently spared the death penalty. Harrison is now in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. His case manager describes him as moderate and non-violent. He is a licensed minister and continues to practice his religious beliefs. It is often said of drug addicts that their sanity returns after they get clean. This may be the case with Harrison Graham. The 65-year-old serial killer continues to serve his sentence and live a quiet life.